thank you for your grace, right? We are doing this training virtually, right? Trainings look different a couple months ago. So thank you for being here, working with us and showing up today. Considering there's probably a lot that you've been working through, right? It's Friday tomorrow. So thank you for being here and making today count. As Courtney mentioned, I'll be your trainer for today. And I'm really here also to listen, to work with you, right? I really want to see this training as much as we can like a potluck, right? Where everyone has something to contribute and can have something to enjoy, right? I also want to be respectful that this training is about trauma. This training is about COVID. And these are two realities, right, that we're both living in right now. And it's so unique and particular to ourselves, to people who we know. And it's known and unknown too, right? What trauma is, what COVID is fully, because we're living in it. So in this training, I just want to tell you off the bat, you are the most important part of this training. And that's what I hope every single person knows in our virtual room, that you are the most important part. So prioritize yourself, what you want to learn, and how you want to be here. Because that's my goal as your trainer with talking about COVID-19 and trauma. And please, if there's any questions, any feedback, anything that you like to share, you can use the chat box, right? We're going to have some breakout rooms. We'll have some polls. And you can privately chat me. My name is Jocelyn Vega. I should say ICOI, if you want to share something more privately as well. So with that, that's my welcome as we move forward. I'm going to do my best to also provide some content warnings. So what's the objective, right? We're here today. What are we doing? I just want to share some things that we are going to work through and some things that we're not. One is that we really want to talk about this moment right now from an individual and a collective place, right? How is this a collective trauma and individual trauma? And what's the association to COVID-19 too, right? So there's trauma and there's COVID and there's the individual and there's a collective, right? So a lot of ways we're going to be moving through this topic is what I'm saying. We also want to talk about coping mechanisms and self-care. This is going to be more from a value perspective, right? What's the framework when we talk about coping mechanisms and self-care, right? Let's talk about this and have a conversation, because sometimes it feels like a task that you have to do, that you're responsible for, and that we have to figure out. And there's so much more to that conversation. So we'll be talking about that later on. We also want to talk about disproportionate impact that Courtney mentioned earlier on, and also talk about community collective care, right? We're going to talk about that briefly towards the end, and how can we model this within our organizations and the communities we work with or have been already. Some things we're not going to be doing today, right? We're not going to be talking about the medical overview of COVID. That is not my background, right? So I just want to tell people that right away. A list of nonprofit funding resources, government policies and practices. I might comment on some policies, right? But the breakdown is something I won't do. And that was a lot of information. So this is just a reflection question for you. What are your objectives? What would you like to take away? You can write this down in your notes. You can think about it. You can not think about it. You can put it in the chat box. But just take a moment. You're here, and I want to honor you and respect your time. So if there's anything you would like to share, I would gladly hold on to that and carry that throughout the training. Just let me know. As people are thinking about their objectives, I also want to slow down and talk about self-care, right? A self-care check. COVID-19 is an ongoing crisis, right? It's something that's still happening and happening in ways that we can't fully see, right? And we feel in so many ways and not just one. And we feel differently too. Maybe a month ago, maybe 3 months ago, maybe a week from now, right? So in this training, a lot of things might come up. As Courtney mentioned, it might be triggering as well, right? So I will do my best to provide content warnings, but it's then really important to give ourselves grace, not just in this training, but in life, right? That's definitely an opinion I have, because none of us have lived through a global pandemic on this scale, right? Unless we've been around for over a little bit, 100 years, we're all living through this, right? So we're giving ourselves grace is really important. Please take a break, right? Please take a break and prioritize yourself. I do not want someone to feel like they're stuck in this chair and they have to be here, right? You are the most important resource, you, in this whole entire training. That's my goal as your trainer today. And this session will be recorded so you can come back whenever and follow this information at your own pace. It'll be here, right? It's really important to move with your body, connect with yourself. You don't have to look at the screen, right? As much as I'm your trainer, wanting to promote information, I want to promote you in this experience, right? So if you want to look out the window, I got a window right here. If you want to get some water, if you want to stretch, you know yourself best, and I only want to support you and promote that. Along with, this is something I tell everyone as a trainer, is that please think of someone or think of an activity that you can debrief, right? So maybe you go on a walk, maybe you just check in with a coworker or your friend, or for me, my puppy, right? And just have a moment to be like, wow, I heard a lot, thought through a lot, some things came up, some didn't, because we deserve that debrief as well. So again, this is the tone that I'm gonna have throughout the training, because I wanna respect you and your time. Right? That's the goal. That's the priority. So the biggest thing, right, is how COVID and trauma overlap, but I don't want to overlook the additional ones, right? And this was part of my design in this poll, is that by learning how COVID-19 and trauma overlaps is by discussing this impact with our peers, right? So you sharing in your chat, you in your breakouts after this training, it's going to be knowledge sharing, right? Those experiences and questions that you feel comfortable with, right? And safe to share, as well as what are organizations doing, right? Let's not overlook the work that we've done, especially as organizations translating things overnight, making our programs not only function, but continuously be a safe space for young people, right? We can't overlook the power and time it's taken to do that. And by those additional, ones that we see below, that's how we learn how COVID-19 and trauma overlap, by connecting with one another. So thank you for my team for launching that poll. I really appreciate it. And now we're gonna dive into the training. So this is just a reference slide. This is just information in general of, I'm gonna be saying COVID-19, not coronavirus. You might hear us say isolation, right? Self-distance, social distancing, and self-quarantine. This is just a reference slide so you know where I'm coming from. That's my goal always. And now, right, we're going to be talking about the traumatic impact of COVID-19. So that objective where a lot of people are like, hey, this is why I'm here. This is what I want to learn. I want to give a content warning that when we experience trauma, right, and we're experiencing trauma right now through COVID, we don't always know the ways in which it's shown up, right? How it's impacting. It's not very clear all the time. There's ways in which our body and our mind protect us from processing an experience, right? Our body is constantly defending us, looking out for us, right? Not only against COVID as a disease, but as a social, emotional experience. A lot has changed in our lives. A lot continues to change. And there's a lot that we've done for ourselves and for others. And that's a lot to experience in 8-9 months, right? That's a huge foundational change to our society. So I just want to give that content warning that this slide might bring some emotions up. I will try my best to provide very general examples to just keep this training open. And I want you to go at your own pace. This is for you and I'm here for you. So keep me accountable. If there's something that I can do better or need to address, let me know. Let me know and we can do it together, okay? So now to move with the content, we're going to be providing a trauma one-on-one very briefly. So we're going to be launching another poll. And again, thank you for your participation, but it's really asking ourselves, right? What is trauma? And this is a poll in progress now, but again, I'm the type of trainer who doesn't believe in one answer. So don't worry about picking the right one. Is it bad things or adverse things that happen to people? Is it that trauma has a context, right? It reflects systematic violence, right? Is trauma just something that impacts individuals, or does it include communities, right? So beyond the individual. or does trauma only come up when we're working with our program participants, right? Is it only at the workplace where we should be talking about trauma and discussing trauma as a team? There's no right answer, remember, right? It's just get the juices flowing, right? So I just want to say thank you for everyone who's participating so far. And I want to say we're kind of across the board, which is great because we're going to be moving across all these points. Heads up, that's where we're going, as a foreshadowing. So I think this is a pretty good place where we can share. And again, we're across that board, right? It's all these things and so many other things that can't be defined, that can't be expressed through words, that can't be organized in a neat definition, right? And that's why I'm biased, and I really appreciate working with Courtney and Nicole with her team, right? That the arts is a really powerful form of expression, right? The ways in which language can express everything. And what are other modes, right? Where expression from experiences like trauma can not only take place, but find a home, right? Find recovery, find a new expression. So just thank you to the team for that poll. I'm going to be moving through information now. I've been talking about trauma loosely in this presentation so far. This is a definition from SAMHSA, our National Mental Health and Substance Abuse Administration, and they define it as 3 E's: as an event, right? Or a series of event, something that is experienced, right? And the experience of an individual, right? Something that's physical, something that's emotionally harmful, and also the effects. So effects is something that we're going to be talking about throughout the training, but I just want to break down this definition to say this is just one definition. If you would have asked me as a teen, as a young person, right, I would not have come up with this, right? So we can expect young people, our program participants, to know exactly what trauma is, right? To exactly know this experience. And even as adults, right, we can be in this experience too. And I just want to say that trauma, right, they have this E of event, but sometimes it's not just one thing, right? Sometimes it doesn't have a beginning and the end through the experience that we have, right? Sometimes it's fuzzy, sometimes it's not clear. Sometimes this event is sustained, chronic. Maybe it's something we're witnessing in our environment to people who we know, right? But we're interrelated. We're impacted by what we see and what happens to people that we know. So that experience of trauma, right, is even just having the language to say, this is what happened to me. This is how I'm able to connect. This is who I'm able to connect with, right? Do I have safety? Do I have someone who's not going to blame me or judge me for speaking my truth, right? Or figuring out what is my truth in these words, right? And it can be really intense to experience victim blaming or judgment or being re-traumatized, right? Like being blamed for an experience that you had, things that you should have done, right? Quote unquote, things that you should have done or shouldn't have done. Those things really hurt. And it comes down to not being validated, not being heard, not being seen as a human, as a person who doesn't have a clear answer right now, right? Doesn't have a clear way to express. And we also live in a society that's really harsh, right? The amount of self-judgment that we do in this culture is something shared across people, right? How we doubt ourselves, right? How we have to blame ourselves. And where's the support from society if we realize trauma is an environmental context, right? Trauma is a form of violence, right? That is part of a larger culture. So what I'm saying is that, right, this is a great definition. It's powerful, it's helpful, it's a baseline. But trauma is not just about an individual. And that, very briefly, is how COVID-19 is a trauma that we're experiencing as an event, as an experience, and as the effects. So we'll walk through it more in the presentation, but that's an expansion that I want to share with each and every one of you, because we deserve trauma as a greater, more inclusive definition, right? We can't just think about the individual and put this expectation on the individual, right? So in the next slide, we're going to be more specific. We're going to have an opportunity to talk about this more, but there's direct impacts of trauma. Sometimes it's also indirect, right? Sometimes we think about trauma as, what physically happened to you, right? What happened to you then and there around you? And it's some of these things. It can be health and safety, right? Stress. I just want to highlight stress is traumatic, right? It's not even just like, I'm stressed out by what's happening. No, it's the stress that our society causes to communities, right? If we're denying communities food, housing rights, right? Security, even just mental safety of being in your environment and not being seen as a threat, that is stress, that is a direct impact, and that is traumatic, right? Breaking it down to the resource access, the ways in which communities are deprived is not a decision communities made. It has a historical context and it's institutional, right? And I'm not talking about right now, these past months, I'm talking about for hundreds of years, right? So medical health care, right? Mental health care are things that have very deep history and have informed trauma within communities. Very unfortunate, right? Professional, I'm going to talk about professionalism throughout this training because as professionals, we experience trauma in the workplace. We experience trauma by how we're not able to fully be ourselves, right? For example, if someone is really struggling at home, right? Maybe is living in an unsafe environment, or maybe it's just exhausted from these past months. We can't always show it because we have to put our professional hat on, right? We might just be really tired to show up to work, right? But we might not even have PTO time, right? And I just want to highlight the direct impact of professionalism of we're doing so much work and you're working more than ever. You're not just working at home, you're working through a crisis. We all are. But where is that flexibility? Where is that acknowledgement as a society of we are working so hard, but how are we working to give people that time, that respect, that recovery? We need to be having these conversations, and we are. I also want to highlight family cohesion, right? And family is not just the biological family. It can be, but it's also your chosen family. It's the people who you live with, the people who you're connected to, right? The ways in which we got to care for each other. We're spending a lot of times indoors, right? We're spending a lot of time together. And education, right? Virtual learning has been tough for many aspects, right? For everyone involved. I also want to highlight routine changes, right? Just ways of life, right? Thinking of, I can easily go here, I can do that, one swoop, I'm out. You got to think about, there might be a line. I might not be able to go to the store right now because I'm exhausted. I don't have a car. It's cold outside. Like all these things impact us, and we need to break it down, right? We deserve to have this recognition of my environment is very traumatic right now. It's not just you as an individual, you are an individual living in an environment. And how is that environment taking care of you? And how are we taking care of each other through these direct impacts? I also want to highlight here the loss and grief, right? This is something that is so important for me to discuss because this might not be seen as direct impact or non-direct. It's so many things at once, right? It can feel physical, it can feel mental, it can feel even spiritual, right? How are we doing as a soul right now in this society, in our humanity, can be a lot. So one things I just want to highlight is the loss without closure. It can definitely be losing someone, and I'll be honest, I've lost quite a few people and people who've been related to other people in my life, right? And just hearing names and kind of a tally is that hurts. That hurts so much to think of death as a tally, right? Of, okay, I'm running out of fingers at this point, right? Or someone I knows someone who's passed away or is in the hospital. And that brings up a lot as a society because maybe we can't visit people. We can't be together. We can't have those life celebrations, right, in the same way. We're not able to say goodbye also to our program participants. I'm gonna be honest with everyone. When shelter in place happened here in Illinois, it was literally under a few days to just come together, figure it out, go home. And the amount of stress and insecurity, that was thrown on us as employees, right? How are we gonna do it? How are we gonna figure it out and keep it cool and collected, right, for our program participants, right? But we ourselves struggle too. not being able to say goodbye, right? Being able to do something overnight, that's demanding. And I just want to respect everyone who's maybe lost job, right? Who maybe is underemployed right now, right? Or might be in a job that's really undermining their mental health right now, right? Because they're demanding that people keep performing, right? Increasing the productivity. Like, hey, there's a global pandemic going on and it's not in my background, right? But sometimes our workplaces are pushing us too hard, right? And I just want to acknowledge that the loss of a job isn't whether you were fired or lost it. The loss of the job can be, wow, my job looks different now and I have to process that. That's really hard, and that's grief. That's grief, and we deserve to have these conversations, right? It's not just you, it's so many of us who are in the situation. The loss of savings. Wealth was an issue for the past hundreds of years in this nation by even how wealth was created, right? Now with job insecurity, right? The uncertain economy, with losing your job, savings is a whole nother conversation, right? Of, do I even have a safety net? But in society, right, in this US culture, it's up to you to have that safety net, right? It's up to you to have savings. And that's unfair and not really realistic for so many of us, right? So when we talk about grief, we're talking about our way of life. We're talking about the planned future we have, life celebrations, right? I'm talking about the birthday, the graduations, the proms. I'm talking about the barbecues, the family reunions, right? The recent holidays that are coming up, right? Those are holidays that are coming up soon. It's like, what do we do? And I just want to tell everyone that grief is something that we don't do culturally, right? Where's the day where we grieve as a nation? How have we grieved collectively? Not only for COVID, but what's happened in this country for hundreds of years and hasn't been acknowledged, right? So as a nation, what does it look like to grieve in public? And we deserve that, right? So I mentioned some of these things. And now with trauma and COVID-19, and we're going to have a breakout soon where we kind of can just talk to a peer, right? That's coming up soon. Is COVID-19 here is coronavirus is a mental health crisis. And for me, this is more my personal opinion. Where's the vaccine for that? Where is the global effort, the national effort to address the mental health crisis that everyone is experiencing to some extent? Tell me when the mind is going to be prioritized, because it's in this body. Our mind is in our body. It's not somewhere else, right? It's not where I check out. We're experiencing a lot of intense emotions, right? By our environment, the loneliness, right? The social withdrawal, and I also want to highlight that so many of us have also built coping mechanisms, right? We found new routines and traditions to make, right? We found maybe some honesty in our situations by being in community, right? By knowing that we deserve more as a people, as a community, as a country, we deserve more. So I just want to highlight that COVID-19 is a mental health crisis, and that we have the opportunity to change. We have the opportunities to support ourselves, but it needs to come from a place of respect, right? Our mental health needs to be respected in the workplace, in our lives. We're doing that already, right? But as a collective society, we need to understand and support our collective health, right? That mental health. So this is just to say that COVID-19 is often talked about physically threatening, right? Something that can happen to your body, but it has a mental health impact. So these are just some common responses, right, that we can see and talk about in our training. So there's worry, anxiety, and fear. And these are common responses because this is what our body does. It's trying to protect us, right? So maybe it will think about the worst case scenario, right? But maybe over these months, I just want to give a recognition. Everyone's been working really hard to be with themselves, right? To allow those emotions even to be present. Sometimes emotions, take their own life of their own and you're living with them, right? So maybe you do feel on edge. I definitely have, right? I've definitely had emotions of feeling very low. And this is just to say that mental health is not just one thing, right? It's a continuum, it's a spectrum, and you are doing your best. You are doing something that no one has ever experienced in their life, right? And we're all experiencing it together in very different ways. I also want to highlight the feeling of anger is such a real feeling. And I just want to say in this training, if this is just, again, I'm trying my best to say like what's my opinion and what's like based on our training and research, right? This is my opinion. But when we talk about anger, it's the expression of having your needs unmet. And not just you right now, but it can be generations, right? Generations of community needs being unmet and being denied. That anger comes from a real place, right? So we can be wrestling with our emotions. We can have this stress, right? So all these things that you're feeling are real and not things you should blame yourself on, because these are common responses that we have in trauma, right? If a young person in our program was telling you, right, I'm worried, I'm anxious, I'm fearful for the future, right? We wouldn't tell that young person, hopefully, you need to toughen up, right? This world's hard. You need to move it forward. We would listen. We would try to be there for that person, because one of the greatest things we can do as humans sometimes is simply listen, simply witness that person, let them know they're being heard. But we can also do that with ourselves. And we've been probably doing that with ourselves, right? We're here today because we've been doing a lot. We've been doing a lot to be here. So I just want to acknowledge that too, and that we deserve that as well. So these are just some resources that we have. Some of them at the bottom are Illinois based, but I just want to ask people, right? If there's resources that work for you, that have been helpful for you, you can definitely share them. And, to go back, right? We talked about the professional impact. So this is a quote that maybe we've heard, right? Of being maybe an essential worker. And maybe if you're not an essential worker, right, working within the grocery stores, working outside, work is essential to many of our lives, right? The fact that we can't work, right? And without work, we can't pay things, right? For a lot of us, that paycheck, we're living that to that next paycheck, right? So I just want to highlight that COVID is traumatic because our financial security is also feeling that pressure, right? And I just want to acknowledge that for essential workers, right, the contradictions that essential workers have faced, because please correct me if I'm wrong, right? It's again my personal opinion. A year ago or 2 years ago, essential workers were called unskilled workers. And overnight now they're essential. And for me, that is just so disrespectful. As I'm not saying that society as individual people, but our culture, our institutions, our economy, to do that to people, right? And who are literally the lifelines for our nation, right? And so much more than that. So I just want to say things as they are. And I also want to say us as individuals working, even if we're doing at home, us working is essential to maintain our livelihoods, right? We need to work to pay things. We need that to sustain ourselves, our families. And that's another stress, even though we have our job. And we're working more than ever, even though we're from home, the ways in which we define boundaries, right? The ways in which we can really leave the work at work, right, is harder because those lines are being blurred. So the honesty, right? The recognition, I'm not saying solves the trauma, right? Solves the issue, but this is places where we can start, right? Like our two people who shared, when we acknowledge, right, we are at least at a place where we see ourselves. What happens next is, I don't want to, speak for them, but they shared that in their share, right? So again, just highlighting the professional impact of COVID-19 that's often not always talked about. These are just some healthcare statistics. I just want to give everyone a heads up. It's a lot of information on the slide, right? Just giving that. But it's just to say, right, from previous pandemics, right? So early COVID-19 studies in China, right? Because this was something that occurred in December last year, already a year. A lot of healthcare staff are reporting stress, anxiety, depression, right? And there's things associated with having more stress. Hypertension is not just, a word to define what you eat and how you move impacts you. Hypertension is an increase of stress in your environment that your body is absorbing and trying to process, right? So when we're thinking about what healthcare workers are experiencing, let's share this with ourselves, right, as workers right now. Of trauma in the workplace, again, is very real, right? People are being burnt out, right? And it can be because of our job, it can be because of our life, it can be for other things, and it can be all those things. And again, we live in a society that really prioritizes productivity, right? Maybe also at the workplace, we see mental health as an individual task. Go on vacation, right? Go take care of yourself. Do self-care. And it's like, yes, I can do those things, but what about my environment, seeing that we're in a crisis and some things need to be adjusted as a team, right? And that we deserve that. We deserve that as well. You're gonna hear me say that so much of we deserve it, because we do. We absolutely do. And this is not a favor being done to us. This is something that we need as a humanity, right? Because we're human. And these are just some tools, just giving everyone heads up. We're gonna have a break soon. It's gonna be a 5-minute break. These are just some digital tools that we just share with people, right? I will send out some PDFs for my people who, like me, are a little bit more old school. I want the paper, I want the slide. I don't want to be on another screen, right? But these are some tools that we can have. So one of them is building our resiliency, right? Just take a moment. You don't have to close your eyes, right? But think about what has supported your resiliency these past months, right? Has it been people? Has it been new routines and habits you've picked up? Maybe it's food, right? Maybe new things that you're doing. And maybe it's also realizing what's not supporting my resiliency, right? What are the things that are soaking me up? And I need that, right? So we can see resiliency from both sides. What supports my resiliency, what doesn't, and what are the things that fall into the middle, right? And doing that from a perspective of what do you deserve? What do you deserve? Because your resiliency is so important. So this is an app that gives you a reminder, right, of when have you taken time for yourself. They have self-assessments too of, okay, let me put a pulse on how I'm feeling, through an assessment by talking with someone. And they also have compassion and satisfaction tools, right? So building compassion within ourselves is one of our greatest tools, right? Being compassionate for ourselves allows us to be compassionate towards others as well. So this is information that will be shared afterwards. This is also another app you're going to have all these slides, everyone. You'll have this information afterwards. But another one is the PT. And this one here has tools for, information about PTSD, but also positive self-talk, right? How do you positive self-talk when you are angry, right? When you are upset, when you're unsure how you feel, right? And other common self-help strategies. I also want to highlight this other app. It's called it's called Heart Rate Free. I was saying the free first before the other word, so apologies. I just want to highlight that this app allows you to check in with how your heart is racing. I also want to say in my culture that I grew up that our heart is actually our first meditation, right? The ways in which you can literally find your pulse and might even struggle to find your pulse. You might say, is it really there, as you like poke your hand looking for it, right? Or your neck. But you realize as you're finding your pulse, right, that skin to skin contact, right? The ability to kind of slow down. Someone asked for the name of the app is PTSD Coach app. And this is going to be in the slide, so you'll have access to this. But the ways in which you slow down to even hear what is happening inside of my body. Our body's constantly giving us information, right? Maybe it's not always clear, but it's always trying to communicate with us, right? So by communicating with our heart, knowing when our heart is racing, when it's slowing down, hearing, by holding on to your pulse, breathing exercises, right? Hearing your heart slow down, right? Kind of low down, has a mental impact on us as well. So that is again, my opinion, right? Throwing a little bit of me of, of how this app can also be done personally, right? By using your heart as a meditation. There's another app that is available called COVID Coach. That is another app that's there, kind of talking way more about the coping mechanisms during the pandemic. This is really, I like it, of emotional well-being, right? So if your emotions are in a really intense place, it doesn't mean your wellness fell apart. Well-being means being with yourself the whole time, right? So the highs and the lows and everything in between. And that's what I like about this, because sometimes we talk about emotions as that's negative, that's positive, you know, like just be positive and it'll be positive. And it's like, that's really helpful, but mental health is a continuum, right? How I feel is not just one thing. And I might not even know how I'm fully feeling too. So giving ourselves that bandwidth, right, of this, there's a flow, there's sometimes not consistency, but that's okay. It's all from me and I deserve to be with myself, however that shows up. So there's also graphs that, you know, help you visualize as well. Again, you're going to have access to all these slides. Now, the rest of the training is really going to be focused on coping mechanisms, right? We're going to have a breakout room soon where this is really going to be the big topic. We're going to be this time like in 3 or 4 people in our group. And just to give you a heads up, that's coming up, and have another share out. But when we talk about coping mechanisms and self-care, it can be a really intense, right? It can be really intense if like I am coping, right? I am caring for myself. I am already doing these things, but I need more than what I can do for myself. Not because I'm not capable or I don't know how to do it. It's because of what's going on in my environment, right? It's what's going on larger scales that impact me in very hurtful individual ways, right? That are hurting my community as well. So I just want to acknowledge and really say that self-care can be a word that we kind of jump at, right? Of just like, I don't need to hear that word right now because I know how to care for myself. I just live in a society that is oppressing me, you know, marginalizing me, undermining my humanity, right? And has done so for lifetimes, for generations, right? To my people for hundreds of years, right? So I just want to say that if you're frustrated by these terms, these frustrations come from larger systems at play, right? So again, I just really want to be respectful that there are many sides, right, to understand these concepts. And I am never going to tell you, this is what it is, this is how we think about it, and let's move on, right? So when we're talking about self-care, I'm going to be providing you, right, like the research, the best practices, but I also want to speak truth that we live in a society that's pretty unfair, right? Very unfair through systemic violence. And I just want to say that, you know, people, communities, ourselves can feel really frustrated by how about addressing the roots of why I need to cope the way I'm coping, right? And from what I'm coping from, right? Why do I need to live in a society that doesn't care for me already, right? That goes beyond my basic needs being met. So again, just being super honest with people in this training that I don't want anyone to feel that individually I'm not doing enough, right? There's a whole context that trauma exists. And when we talk about COVID-19 and trauma, right, there are some things that are happening to people and impact some in very different ways due to class, due to race, due to wealth, right, as some examples. And I just want to be, again, super honest and respectful of that reality that many of us are in and know people in. So now to give you like the best practices, right? Because both can exist, right? Both can exist. We can know our truth despite society, right? That we deserve our reality. We deserve to have coping, right? But we also deserve not to be oppressed, right? So now to give you the best practices of, you know, what is coping mechanisms? What is self-care, right? From a clinicianal, right, mental health perspective. When we talk about coping mechanisms, it's really the strategies that we use in the moment, right? It's when we're facing stress to manage painful and difficult emotions. So maybe it's your go-to tools, right? What are things that you do throughout the day that we might not even recognize, right? So someone might work out, right? Someone might go on a walk. Someone might journal or doodle, right, during a meeting to maintain focus, right? So what are your go-to tools? And this is something, if you feel safe and comfortable, I really recommend, taking the time to do this, right? So I see in the chat box arts, right? That's definitely a go-to tool, right? And what are the things that help you relieve stress and improve your mood, right? So it's not, denying what you feel and putting yourself in another place. It's how am I coping with the honesty of what's happening right now, right? How am I supporting me so I know what tool is the best tool, right? I can even identifying our emotions, everyone, that's powerful. That's powerful. It might not feel like you're right, especially if it's an intense emotion, but identifying which tools help you when you're in that situation or with that emotion, and seeing an emotion as a relationship, right? What is the relationship I have with this emotion? And it doesn't have to be in this moment right now, but that emotion also has history, right? So when you feel safe and comfortable, these are just some practices that we're just sharing, right? And sometimes you can see coping mechanisms as quick fixes, right? So maybe it's how you take a break, right? It's how you release judgment, right? But when we talk about self-care, self-care is when you're not always necessarily in the stressful moment, right? Like in the moment, self-care is more of like, maybe I've had a stressful week. Maybe it's just been stressful overall. What are the things that I can do for my future self, my past self, my present self to look out for myself, right? And that can take many forms. How you choose to advocate for yourself and be with yourself is several things. So maybe you schedule it out, right? So for example, me, I'll put myself on the spot. I really, really take time to be alone with myself. That's something I never did before COVID, right? I was the social butterfly, right? And that really took a big hit, right? When I couldn't see my people or anyone, right? So for me, learning how to build time with me as a way to spend time with myself didn't feel like self-care. Felt kind of awkward, if I'm being honest. But now it's something I intentionally schedule with myself and do activities to learn more about myself, right? And the goal of self-care, it isn't to look at a part of yourself that you feel like, oh, I gotta work on that. This is something deficient that I gotta do. I want to change this about me, right? It can be, but the goal of self-care, right, is to restore yourself, be with yourself. It might be recovering, right? Recovering from stress, recovering from a constant rush, right? Self-care is for you and only you. So that's up to you to decide. And it's also, what's that motivation, right? So with the upcoming breakout, we're going to be discussing some coping strategies, and you're going to have these slides, but increasing self-awareness, right? So how does that show up when you cope, right? When you're coping, right, you're deciding what's your go-to tool, what aspect of yourself do you identify with, right? Is it how your body's changing, right? Maybe you feel tense. Maybe it's racing thoughts, right? Maybe it's the fact that you can't focus, right? And that's okay. That is all self-identification, right? Taking that mindful action of, you know what, I'm going to sit with this. I'm going to decide to do nothing. I'm going to check in with someone. Even just saying that you are upset, right? And allowing yourself to be upset. Because one thing with COVID-19, everyone, not to bring it back to earlier in the presentation, but it's extremely triggering. It can be extremely triggering, giving a content warning of just trauma when you're younger, just giving that content warning. You can be triggered from earlier experiences of your life right now with COVID, feeling isolated, right? Feeling like your needs are not being met, feeling abandoned by people you love, right? There's so many things that can come up with COVID, and even taking that mindful action of, this emotion has a history, but I also have my own history and how I want to understand it, what meaning I pull from it. Creating downtime, right? So time to just truly do what you want to do for you. This isn't getting the chores done, right? This isn't, making a home project. It can be if that's your way to channel it, but really time for you in this body, in this life right now. What does that look like for you? Spreading compassion. Spreading compassion starts with ourselves, as well as attending to our emotions, right? And that is not just, talking or, identifying. You have your own self-expression. And I think that's one thing the arts, this is my personal opinion, the arts can show us, right? What is your personal expression? What is your way to connect, right? Your way to make something and see how that experience changes you, right? So these are just some examples that I want to share with everyone to prepare you for your breakout. I also want to, again, highlight as a society, right? What are some pitfalls we're seeing across the society, right? This is not just individual people, right? But really says a lot about our culture. Maybe it's avoidance, right? As I said earlier, when have we as a nation publicly grieved, right? For each other, for our own losses, right? Not just COVID, but even before this, right? How do we grieve for one another and grow in grief, right? So that's an example of avoidance as well. It can be numbing and withdrawal, right? And that those are protective mechanisms, right? Our body is just trying to protect us. So maybe right now it is withdrawing. Maybe right now I do need to be alone and lie down, right? So again, this is, as someone said earlier in the share, this is not to shame people. And this is not to be ashamed if you need to withdraw a little bit, right? But I just want to tell everyone that when we withdraw, it's really hard to selectively withdraw, right? Our body and our mind are so interconnected. So if you withdraw physically, it might impact us emotionally and mentally too. And again, it's not to be ashamed or shame anyone. It's just an opportunity to connect with yourself. And someone said in the share out, what resources and help do I need? And I don't have to be ashamed, right? Anger as well is something we've seen in our society as well. For example, just blaming marginalized groups, right? For social distancing. It can also be having outbursts, right? We can have some outbursts sometimes because we're pent up. So these are things that we might see and have witnessed. And this is one slide I have here that I want to talk about before we go into our breakout room, is that when we talk about self-care, this is Jocelyn speaking to you about self-care, not necessarily like the best practices, but I want to tell everyone it's not self-punishment. The amount of times I grew up, and even just now, right, hearing about self-care as work on yourself, right? You like get it together with yourself, and that's hurtful. That is super helpful, like hurtful. Or hearing self-care as, well, just buy yourself things, right? And it's like, yes, that could work, but what about self-care as self-choice? How are you choosing to be with yourself in this life, right? How are you, doing self-advocacy, right? Or even just acknowledging, right? Acknowledging self-care as what you have accomplished, what you have overcome. Self-care as all the times you stood up after falling down, right? And the amount of work and effort and love that it takes during those really challenging moments. We don't talk about self-care like that. We talk about it as like, as the height, right? But self-care, again, is a continuum, right? Of all stages and parts of our lives. And I just want to say that self-care can also be honoring yourself, honoring your mental health, right? And how you've been honest with yourself, right? It can be the emotional relationships you've had, maybe spiritual, interpersonal. I also want to highlight that we're multi-dimensional, right? So our past is with us, our future is with us as we're alive right now. And I also just want to say that, when we look at self-care and we think about physical self-care, our mind could immediately go to, I want to run a marathon, right? I want to change myself physically, but it can also be something really simple, right? Of physically, I want to change my relationship with food, maybe how I eat, right? Maybe it's cooking recipes. And that is a way to connect with your physical body in a way that maybe in mainstream society, we don't always talk about. So in this slide, just please know that self-care is your choice. If you like, it's something I just want to offer everyone. you can copy this when you get the slides and give credit to yourself on everything that you've been doing for yourself throughout these past months and even your life, right? How do you cope, have coped, right? How have you accomplished these things? Because self-care is not what's missing, what you got to do more of, what you got to pick up. It's seeing yourself in the mirror and feeling proud, seeing yourself and giving yourself that mental and emotional support. Again, that is just how I present self-care, and just want it to be something that's flexible for everyone, because sometimes it can feel very narrow. And in the next slide, it's something you're going to have in a handout afterwards, but it discusses radical acceptance. So how do we be present with ourselves without the intense desire to change it? This is something we might hear, right? Recognizing what is, how can we act, right? What are the tools that we have? And in the handout, there's going to be way more information, but one of the first stages is seeing how we resist, right? Struggling what comes up again. So for me, as I mentioned earlier, not being able to see people, that's something that I highly resisted, right? Something that impacted me in so many ways. And what this handout also recommends is, how do you explore this discomfort, right? Again, with safety and support, how do you explore discomfort? What does that look like? And if it's a barrier, right? If it's hard, that's okay. That's part of the resistance, right? And then how do we safely endure? How do we stay safe as we're identifying difficult emotions, as we're identifying our needs? Because safety is a priority, right? We can't feel better or reach feeling better if we don't feel safe, if we don't feel secure, if we're not being seen. So that tolerating is, how do we safely endure, right? Holding steady with discomfort, with what we're struggling against, as well as allowing feelings to come and go. So like I said in the training, right, there's no right answer. There's no end, right? How do you allow yourself to come and go? Along with, how do we befriend difficult emotions, difficult experiences, which I say that's something I struggle with a lot, right? And if we're talking about COVID-19, maybe some of us are in the tolerating, the exploring, the resisting, or maybe already at the befriending stage. But just knowing that, again, this is a process, right? So we'll have more information after COVID-19. And that's one way, one of the many ways that we can define COVID, is that it's a collective trauma. We'll be diving a little bit more into that right now. Here's the definition. And again, you're going to have access to these slides, but what is a collective trauma, right? This is when trauma reaches a level where entire groups, right? So we're talking with COVID all over.
Hi, I'm on a thing, but it's only 10 more minutes, so.
Okay. And it collects everyone, right? Suffering collectively, right, from the exposure. But something that's really important to highlight is that how collective is the collective trauma, right? So that take us to the second E, right? The second E of trauma is the experience. So here's a quote that I feel like captures the experience of trauma, is that we're facing all the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. Some of us are on yachts, some of us are in dinghies with holes on them, right? And this is something we've been talking throughout the trainings. Your experiences, your identities, maybe where you are and who you're connected to highly impacts us, because we're interdependent, right? We're so interdependent, interrelated to one another. What someone does can impact us a lot, right? Emotionally, physically, socially, right? So this is just to say, yes, this is a collective trauma, but due to historical disparities, right, across the world at this point, the collective impact is being thrown onto others more than it is being shared, right? So what we do now is really important as a collective, of staying collective through this collective trauma. There's the storms of crisis, right? So some individuals have more privilege than others, right? Some are marginalized in many aspects, right? So maybe limited access to child care, right? Maybe we're destitute of not being able to do a lot of things. And the thing is, though, as a collective, how are we looking out for one another? How are we supporting our fellow human right now? Even the way how you check in and allow someone to express themselves, you allowing someone to be heard and listened to can have a huge impact. But as a society, right, how are we improving what has been and how we need to improve because there's not much of a choice, right? And that we deserve that across the board. So with that, we just want to respect too, and we've been talking about groups and experiences across this training. And again, in this recap, it's really to tie things together. Here are just some really brief examples, right, of communities. And I just want to say there's so many communities here that are not listed. And I just also want to highlight that even within these communities, there are many communities inside each bullet point, right? A community is not just one thing. There's many identities that exist within each community and across communities, right? So us as a collective isn't how are we being impacted as individuals, it's what are the systems and societies at play in history that is impacting us disproportionately, right? So then that takes us to something we've been talking throughout this training of collective care, right? This is something really important and powerful because we can talk about the example of mutual aid networks, right? On how do we create solidarity, right? How do we create systems where we know people's needs are not being met and we're showing up for each other is what it really comes down to, right? So here's an example of a map in the United States. If people want to come back to this resource, there's an example that I'll briefly mention, right? In Chicago, that has a community response team. But this is something that has been happening across the country. I also want to acknowledge, this is some of their numbers. I want to acknowledge that collective care is an ancestral practice. It is something that communities across the world have been doing as an ancestral practice, as intergenerational care for a very long time. So collective care is not brand new. This can be, how our extended families take care of one another, right? It can be the ways in which communities created solidarity in the face of oppression, right? And colonization. It's the ways in which communities have been not only surviving, but thriving with each other against violence, right? And within tradition, within culture, within connection. And we have so much to learn from ancestral practices and our own ancestors as well when we think about collective care as a humanity and what we can do for our humanity moving forward. So in the final moments, we have 5 minutes left. If you want to come back to this slide, you can use this as a model of what are the total calls you're receiving at your organization, right? What are the types of calls? What are the types of requests people are asking when they're asking for help? How do we as an organization complete those requests, right? So this isn't a way to identify as an organization in your program, how do we help people and what has been the help requested as just one example. So how do you give back? It's starting with yourself. Mindfulness, right? Another word I like to use for mindfulness is that self-acceptance, right? It's how are you accepting yourself as human? Self-kindness is something that is different for everyone, but it can boil down to forgiveness. How are you forgiving yourself right now, living through a global pandemic? Along with the final one, right, of that connectedness, right? We deserve this as well. So I'm going to transition to Courtney so that she can make a last minute announcement, and then we'll have time for maybe 1 or 2 share outs.
Hi, thank you so much, Jocelyn. And just also thank you for your tremendous authenticity and guidance. And thank you to all of you for showing up today, for being here, for your brave sharing, and for your compassion. We hope that this time and the resources provided have been helpful. I think that Jocelyn did an incredible job at really kind of capturing the zeitgeist of the current moment, but also how we can kind of become more proactive in ensuring the well-being of ourselves and others. So thank you so much.